Welcome back to the Point of Order podcast, an inside look at California politics in the state legislature. I'm your host, Assemblyman Josh Hoover from the 7th Assembly District in Sacramento County. And today I'm joined by Kirk Feely, who's the budget director for the Senate Republican Caucus. We actually were going to have Senator Roger Nealo on, who he and I actually have a lot of overlap in our Senate and Assembly districts, who is the vice chair of the budget. Unfortunately, wasn't able to be on with us today, but Kirk is the guy with the numbers behind all of Roger's work in the state Senate. So, Kirk, welcome to the podcast. I really appreciate you coming on with us.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. And I'm sure I'm a poor substitute for Senator Nealo, but
hey,
glad to be here anyway. So
we're glad to have you, and I really appreciate you taking a little time to talk to us about the governor's recent budget announcement. But before we get into that, tell us maybe just a quick summary of your background in Sacramento and what got you into fiscal policy.
Yeah, thanks. I initially started out after college with a focus on corporate finance, the private sector. But then through various issues, I just became interested in policy work and actually helping to create policies that that can help people out. And so I turned over to public policy world. I initially started with the Department of Finance way back in the day, worked there a few years. Then I went to the Non-partisan Legislative Analyst office for several years, and then came over to the Senate Republican Caucus over a decade ago. So that's the very short version of what brings us here today.
So you've seen the budget from a lot of different perspectives. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah, absolutely. Like the only seat around the table I haven't had is an elected member at this point in time. So
very nice. So what is your what was your experience with the LAO? Like, what was the kind of from kind of that standpoint? Obviously, LAO being our nonpartisan legislative analysts. What was your experience like there?
It was a very positive one overall. I think if you wanted to try to take maybe what you do in a master's degree program in government or policy and translate that to the real world, the LAO is one of the closest places where that can happen, because they really do try to look at what the data shows, what the numbers show, try to approach things from a nonpartisan standpoint, and come up with, as best as they can, something that reflects a nonpartisan recommendation. Now, there's obviously a lot of issues that are, around which there are a lot of very strong opinions, and so it's hard to be totally nonpartisan on everything. But they don't come from it from a standpoint of which side wants something, what advocate groups want something or not. They try to say what's the unvarnished data as best as we can identify it. So in that sense, it's the most pure policy work I think you can do in a real world setting. So it was overall a very positive experience, and I enjoyed it there. Yeah. So things to say about it.
I always look to them, right, for a lot of the work that I do for their expertise, because I know they're just giving you the numbers, they're giving you their analysis, but they're and they're also tasked with writing the analysis for all the initiatives and propositions. I mean, they hold a lot of responsibility, and they don't have that political pressure, which I appreciate.
And there are some initiatives that never make it to the public's notice that are rather interesting.
I bet there are.
That they have to write up as a requirement of law that they spend some time doing, and they have to sort of treat it as though it could be a real initiative, even though privately they may realize that this is not a serious effort to change policy.
That's really interesting. So they have to actually do the research and all that stuff. That's really interesting. Yeah. So I mean, the big news, right, over the past week was the governor came out and announced his annual budget on January 10th. So I just wanted to talk with you a little bit, really get your take on or your first impressions of the governor's budget. I think speaking of the LAO, a little bit prior to his announcement, they had announced something like a $68 billion deficit for California this year in this upcoming budget cycle. The governor came out last week and said, nope, it's going to be 38, a little less than $38 billion deficit. So $30 billion difference there. What were your initial reactions to the governor's announcement and some of the things you found interesting?
Well, initially, the difference between the two numbers initially was really surprising. The governor had kind of hinted in some talk he'd given previously that his budget problem or deficit might be a little lower. I had not anticipated originally it'd be $30 billion lower. That's a big difference. So that was the initial reaction. I think once you dig into the numbers a little bit more, the numbers are not quite as different as they seem from that initial description. And without going into too much detail, there's various assumptions you can make about whether you treat a certain type of spending as automatic or not, whether it's included in what you would spend otherwise.
Got it.
And so that accounts for part of the difference. So I think the most substantial difference that people might want to know about is that the governor projects that tax revenues are going to be $15 billion higher than what the LAO thinks. So some of the other differences account for are more into that kind of accounting weeds.
Of course,
but but that's a big difference. The $15 billion in revenue.
It's a huge difference.
And it is and it isn't. So in raw dollar terms, absolutely $15 billion is a big number. If you look at it as a percent of the state budget, it's particularly over a couple of years, it's actually not that big percentage-wise.
Sure.
So I think it's certainly convenient for the governor that his revenue projection is higher. That leaves him with a smaller problem to solve.
Right.
I think what people want to think about, or what members in the legislature want to think about, is they're going to have to make a decision what they find more plausible. Is the fact that it helps the governor to have a higher revenue number, is that merely convenient? Is that implausible? And those are questions that the senators and assembly members are going to have to sort out. But so we don't know if that's like I said, it's certainly convenient for the governor. That doesn't mean it's ridiculous.
Yeah, for sure.
But that'll all have to be discussed, and it's a long process. And the revenue numbers will be updated in May. In the governor's May revision. So that's going to be, so really everything right now is preliminary, and a lot more will become a lot more concrete once we get to May and things get locked down in that last month.
Will we get a clearer picture, or will he and everyone else get a clearer picture of the revenues as we get closer to May? Or
definitely a more clear picture for sure. And that was actually one of the problems with the budget that was enacted last June, is that it was done in the context of the federal government having delayed the normal tax filing deadline at that point up to mid-October. And then at the last minute, the feds and the state corresponded to that, moved it back to November as well. So
you're flying blind, basically.
You're kind of flying blind. I mean, there's some data, but it's certainly not it's not super reliable. I mean, it can change a lot in any year, any normal quote unquote year. But in a year where people aren't filing until October, that just adds that much more volatility to the whole revenue picture. And particularly in California, the overall tax revenue, certainly on personal income taxes in California, is very heavily dependent on a relatively really small group of high-income tax-paying families. Really, the top 1% of tax-paying families in California pay about half of all personal income taxes.
It's incredible.
And that's in turn about 2/3 of the total general tax revenue. So you're talking fewer than 200,000 tax-paying units or tax-paying families in a state of 39 million people. If a few of those people, I mean, to kind of paraphrase an old saying, if a few of those people sneeze, then California's budget catches a cold. So so that kind of concentration among a small number of high income people, combined with the tax deadline being moved back, created a lot more unknowns. And who are the people who are likeliest to, be waiting to the last minute because they have, they have attorneys and tax preparers who are not wanting to pay, a moment before they have to. Probably some of your higher income earners are going to be the ones who say, if I don't have to pay in April, I'm not going to. So let's just move it back till October. And then when October rolled around and then delayed again to November, we were really looking at the end of November after Thanksgiving before we could see the best picture of what the revenues were going to be. Yeah. And at that point, it became clear that a lot of the revenue that was being assumed in the budget just wasn't materializing. And so that's a big part of how we ended up with the deficit, however you want to define it.
Yeah, so, for sure. Well, and not to take too big of a tangent this year, but speaking of big taxpayers, I got a kick out of I think it was the controller who raised a stink about Shohei Ohtani, the new Dodgers, player, deferring 698 billion or whatever of his salary.
Million, I think he's
or $1 million. Yeah,
he's getting paid, but not that
I'm
much.
talking in budget terms. Right?
In
California,
budget terms,
I'm used to talking in billions with the budget.
Yeah,
68.98 million. Deferring that, and California obviously not seeing any of that, which I thought was kind of an interesting way to grab headlines, but I don't think there's actually much to be done on that issue.
Yeah, I think the controller had issued a call for the federal government to change the tax law so that he couldn't do that.
Sounds like they're a Giants fan. That's all.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, no doubt.
It was funny though. I actually ran into the governor about a week before he announced his budget, and he was kind of griping about that too. And him and I, one thing we share is we're both Giants fans, so it was pretty funny.
You're a Giants fan?
Yeah,
okay.
Absolutely.
I thought you were from Southern California.
No, I went to school down there, but I grew up in NorCal. Gotta root for the Giants. So
okay.
But we're gonna get our butts kicked no matter what here in the coming year, I think, by the Dodgers. But we'll see how that goes. So we have a rosier, obviously, projection for revenues from the governor. That explains at least part, or at least half of the difference between the non-partisan LAO and his projections. But moving forward, I mean, what are the governor's solutions for solving that deficit? I think is another good question. What is he proposing?
Yeah, so he's kind of got a laundry list of things, and some of it in budget public finance world are what you might call oldies but goodies. So in terms of things that make the budget balanced on paper, but not balanced in terms of really matching up ongoing revenues and ongoing expenditures. So there's some things in there like fund shifts, which is a nerdy sounding term where we basically pay for something out of a different pot of money that doesn't count towards our deficit. You've got some delays of things that they were going to spend. They're going to say, okay, now instead of spending it this year, we'll spend it next year, the year after. But it's still in the long-term plan to spend. In the most, I would say the most kind of tried and true accounting gimmick, if you will, is that they have a proposal to delay paying state employees by something around a week in total, if not less, but just moving a payroll that the state runs from June 30th, when it would count towards this fiscal year, into the first week of the next fiscal year. Wow. So it looks like we're not spending it, even though it's just literally being delayed, by less than a week.
A few days.
Yeah, Holy so that's honestly one that's been used by governors in the past. It's not new.
How big of a fiscal impact is that one?
I want to say that one's maybe $1.6 billion.
That's a lot of money.
Don't quote me on that, but I believe it's over $1 billion. Yeah,
that's incredible though.
Yeah, so that's kind of a classic maneuver. There's some things in that. There's borrowing from what we call special funds, which is like, again, other accounts the state has. It's not, borrowing from the bond market because California has to get approval from the voters to do that.
Okay.
So, but it's internal borrowing, you could say. So those are some of the sort of short-term kinds of maneuvers that balance it on paper, but really don't hit or have any effect on a program.
Yeah.
One significant thing, though, that the governor is doing that is, legit part of the whole structure of the budget, he's taking money out of reserves. So that is probably the single biggest component of what he's doing. And that is part of the state budget reserves, what we call it the rainy day fund, that was started by a bipartisan initiative in 2014, something that Republicans had pushed for a long time. Democrats came together at that time as well, and on a bipartisan manner, put that on the ballot. Voters approved it. So that mandates that we set aside reserves every year. We've been doing that for, since that time. And so we do have reserves that are supposed to be used for this kind of scenario if you do have a real budget shortfall. So the governor's tapping into that. That's not a surprise. That's something that, reserves are there for when you have significant budget problems. The one thing that I do notice is that actually, if you turn back to last June, we did have those unknowns about what the revenues would be. But even at that time, we knew that there was going to be a deficit the year after the budget we passed last year. So even last year, I would say that the things we had a deficit last year, the solutions that were enacted in the budget were kind of along those lines of one-time, somewhat gimmicky borrowing, deferrals, sorts of things. So we knew there was going to be a deficit, or last year the projection was we were going to have a deficit this year anyway. It was going to be more in the scope of 10 to 15 billion. And then when the revenues, took the fall that they did, then the deficit became that much bigger. So it is a little bit, it was a concern certainly for me last year that the budget was already planning essentially to have deficits this year.
Right.
One could argue that, the reserves are for unexpected deficits, not for planned, shortfalls of the budget. And we really, in essence, planned to have a shortfall of some kind this year. So now the reserves are coming out, and it's just that the deficit is a lot bigger because the revenues ended up lower than people thought they would be last year.
Well, and that the shortfall too is greater than the reserve account, right? So does that mean we just go into next year with no reserves?
You're correct. The shortfall is a lot bigger. The general reserve was in the range of I think 25 billion or so.
Okay.
There's also a separate school reserve. But the governor is not. The governor in his plan, it would leave about 18 billion in reserves even after taking money out. And then he turns to these other types of things we've talked about to solve the rest of the budget problem. So if his plan were the one that was enacted, and we know the legislature will always make some changes, there still would be some reserves going into next year, and I think that's certainly a good place to be. You don't want to go in with no reserves. Honestly, we used to do that when I first started. There was no substantive reserve requirement, so we used to have really, really low reserves. We're a lot better off now than we were then in that perspective. But there are some reserves in the governor's plan still, and that's important. If you look at similar to last year when we knew there would be a deficit the year after the budget year. If you look at the forecast now, the governor himself or his Department of Finance provides 3 years of forecast past the budget year, and even in his own forecast, the deficits return in a real big way the year after this. So in the realm of $30 billion deficit already, even if we took the governor's plan and just enacted it as is. So right now, if we took his plan, we'd already know we'd have a big problem next year as well.
Right.
And he's actually got deficits in his forecast each year after that. So it's really a case of, not aligning revenues and expenditures for the long term if you look at his plan going forward. And if you look like 3 years down the road, cumulatively, he has $91 billion in deficits that would exist. Now, the state cannot legally enact budgets that have deficits, so we would never get to a $91 billion deficit in terms of what we enact. But it just means we would have to have solutions each of those years to address those deficits that in his plan are already baked into the cake. So even if we just took his plan as is and enacted it, and when I say we, I should say the legislature more broadly, both houses have to pass a version of the budget and agree on it with the governor. So using the collective we there.
So the deficits, though, I mean, they're not going anywhere, and then that doesn't even include any potential unexpected economic downturn or something, right?
Right, exactly. So, that's if everything goes as planned, and the one thing we know is that it never does. So so that's why you want to have cushions in your budget. You want to have reserves.
Yeah.
And I would say you don't want to be flying so close to the line of breaking even. You want to leave yourself more cushion so that every year you've got, an operating surplus at least a little bit so that you can, plus your reserve account so that if things do go horribly wrong, then you've got more leeway to make up for it. I
think the legislature would be wise, obviously, as someone who's on that side of things, but it's just, to tell the governor not to kick the can down the road, maybe to come, respond with a more responsible budget. I'm not sure that they will. I haven't really heard what's going to be proposed on that end, but it just seems like this is just another kind of trying to defer the problems for another day.
Yeah, I think certainly that's what the numbers would bear out, and and it avoids having members take arguably harder votes to that would do something that they certainly weren't hoping to do when they got elected and came to Sacramento. So
Yeah.
that would move things in what members would perceive to be the wrong direction. So.
No, that's another another good point. So the LAO put out a response to governor's budget. One of the things they said is that his revenue estimates, going back to what we were talking about earlier, are plausible but optimistic. I would say, I think the press kind of pushed him on that a little bit too in his press conference. Why are you being so much more optimistic? But the LAO agrees that they're very optimistic. They also said in their report that state revenues in the out years would need to exceed the administration's forecast by roughly $50 billion per year in order to sustain the spending proposed by the governor's budget. I mean, translate that for us. I think it kind of goes back to the point you just made, but
yeah, exactly. I mean, it's not the revenues and the expenditures are not aligned. So you would have to avoid making some kind of budget adjustments or solutions, whether it's cuts, fund shifts, raising taxes, whatever down the road, the governor would have to essentially discover a windfall of revenue from other sources that surprise to the good, and to the tune of tens of billions of dollars a year to get things to pencil out down the road. Yeah, that's pretty unlikely. So, and certainly not something that you would want to bank on as you're enacting the budget. So I think for this year that we're trying to pass a budget for now, saying they're plausible but optimistic is, and having been at the LAO, the LAO is not bombastic.
Right.
They are anti-bombastic. So they have internal debates about whether to use very subtle nuances of wording that it might come across too strong. Okay, so
So that's a nice way of saying.
Yeah, that's a nice. I mean, if I were to translate, they're saying like, yeah, we really don't think so. My friends who work over there may not, put it that way, but as I read it, they're saying like, yeah, that doesn't look likely to us.
Well, and also I think another point that they made in their report, but it's I think a valid one, is why not go with the more conservative estimate?
Yeah.
Why base your entire budget on an overly optimistic view of what could happen, and then just have to solve an even bigger problem later, right? It's
that's right. It's certainly the more cautious approach to go with a lower revenue number. And the previous governor, actually Jerry Brown, kind of seemed to roll that way in a lot of his budgets. He tended to use a more, in some cases, lower than the LAO revenue projection. Yeah. And what that does is it almost acts like sort of a pocket reserve, because you're not planning to spend. It does two things. One is that you're not spending the money right up front, and so that keeps spending lower at the outset. But then if things do come in to the better compared to your forecast, then you have a pleasant surprise instead of a unpleasant surprise.
Which seems like it would be much more, a much easier way to do it on the back end.
It does,
to have a little extra money that you weren't expecting versus having a bigger pull.
You're right. I would say Jerry Brown did have the benefit of presiding at a time when revenues were nationwide. This wasn't a California specific thing, but the decade from roughly 2010 onward was pretty strong economic growth nationwide, and so Jerry Brown had the luxury to some extent of he could take a lower revenue projection and still be growing year after year. Whereas if you took a lower revenue projection now, you're going to have to come up with that many more solutions, whether that's again that list of cuts, deferrals, borrowing, tax increases, whatever it may be. So Jerry Brown did have a little bit of a luxury in that sense. But
no, and that's a good point too. It's amazing to me when you look at, and just looking at this budget compared to past budgets, when you look at how big the budget has grown since the time of Jerry Brown. It's almost mind blowing. I mean, when you include the all the federal money and the bond dollars, the special funds, all of that were $438.9 billion in the coming year. And then if you look at where the budget was 2011 and 12, general fund spending has grown by $122.3 billion since 2011-12, which that's a 141% increase. I mean, that's kind of mind blowing to me.
Yes.
A little over a decade.
And at a time when California's population grew by, I want to say about 4% total over that decade. So you have the budget more than doubling. You have population basically just barely inching forward. So that is an astonishing increase. And what happened there, and a lot of that growth actually happened in the 2 pandemic budget years, actually, because what you saw was the federal government spending a lot of stimulus money in those 2 years. You also had this big stock market surge, which California, home to Silicon Valley, some of the most successful companies probably in the history of the world, were seeing their stock prices jump up. California has a very high capital gains tax revenue. It's a big part of the revenues every year from capital gains. So we really saw booming budgets unexpected at the start of the pandemic. What happened the next couple of years was really unprecedented. So if you look at if you go back to 2016, between that year and what we ended up spending in 2022, a 6-year period, you had state general fund double in that time frame. 6 years, essentially doubling the budget. That's an astonishing increase. It's mind blowing, and so so that was a big part of what you're talking about. That longer run up was actually a lot of that in just the last 2 years of the pandemic. So.
Well, and it's hard for me not to editorialize a bit here, but when you double your state spending, you might expect some amazing results, right?
One might.
Best roads. No, on the other hand, we have the 46th ranked roads in the nation. We have skyrocketing homelessness. We're 50th in literacy as a state. We've got energy rates that are higher than they've ever been, and an unreliable grid. I mean, so. I think it's frustrating, right, for the taxpayer and everyone to know, like, we're spending more than we ever have, and by leaps and bounds, and we're still paying the most and getting the least in return.
Yeah, and I think there are some problems that you can't spend your way out of. Obviously, I'm coming from a guy who works for the Republican Caucus, but there's but if you look at housing and homelessness, 2 major issues facing the state, there has not been a lack of spending by the state on those issues in the last few years. Look at the housing numbers. Obviously, the cost of housing is a huge problem on a variety of levels, and the state has spent more and more money on housing. We had a total of $40 billion from starting in 2018 up through 2022, various types of housing subsidies. The governor had stated he wanted to build 3.5 million homes by 2025. So through 2022, the state had permitted less than 600,000 housing units.
Wow.
Okay, so that's
a little short of the goal.
A little short of the goal. And the governor, as I recall, did revise his goal so that it was a smaller number with a date that's further out down the road. But fewer than 600,000 units in a 4 or 5 year period is not addressing the housing shortage that we have, and that's despite spending $40 billion on housing programs. Now, in contrast, you look at states like Texas and Florida. States that are smaller by comparison in population, both of those states built more housing than California in that same time frame.
Wow.
I'm not sure how much they had in the way of housing subsidies. I kind of doubt it was as large as what California was spending. Yeah. But I think that's an example of, even though my focus is on the budget can help in some areas. It can't solve all the problems in the world, though. And if you have a regulatory structure that is problematic, you can't just spend your way out of that. You have to change the underlying laws and regulations that are, creating problems in the first place, rather than just saying, hey, let's have a program that, we'll throw $100 million at this grant program or this subsidy program. And it sounds nice. It makes a good headline, members, a lot of elected officials like to have a headline that say they, got this amount of money for somebody or this, that, and the other. Yeah. But you just simply can't spend your way out of a lot of problems. And that seems like what California has tried to do in the last several years.
Absolutely. And I think the point about the regulatory environment is an important one. And it's just an acknowledgement. And what our state, I think, needs to acknowledge is that government doesn't build housing. Like, you can subsidize,
We're trying.
do all these programs. We are trying.
The state
but
is
it's
trying.
not
Excuse me.
working,
That's
right?
not
It's
we
like,
again, but the state is trying to. The
state's trying
to subsidize housing, but
absolutely. But at the end of the day, the way to build housing, or one of the ways to build housing, is to make an environment, a regulatory environment, where it's affordable, right? And it's doable. And we haven't done that. We haven't taken the steps necessary to do that, I don't think.
Right.
So.
And a lot of the laws and regulations that, drive up the cost of building a housing unit. So that if you do have some kind of grant program or subsidy program from the state, but you've driven up the cost of a housing unit, then even your grant dollars aren't going to go as far.
Yeah.
It just makes it problematic on multiple fronts. So
absolutely. So before we move on to what's next, because I do want to ask you about what you see coming down the road for the budget, and kind of process for next steps. But one thing I always harp on, and I had to point out and ask you about, is I noticed that in the governor's budget, he does touch on the unemployment insurance fund.
Right.
And obviously, for those that aren't familiar with it, if you're a business owner, you absolutely know this. But during the pandemic, California took out a loan from the federal government to prop up its unemployment insurance fund. That has to get paid back by employers in the form of essentially a higher payroll tax over the next that exponentially grows over the next few years until it's paid off. I found really interesting that in this budget, he tries to borrow some money to also pay for the state's interest obligations, which has always been a state-funded thing. The employers tend to pay the principal on that loan,
exactly,
and the state picks up the tab for the interest on that loan. This year, he's using funds from the state employer training fund to help pay the interest on it as well, which I don't know if you've got. I know this is a really minutiae question. It's just frustrating for me because I hear from business owners a lot in my district when we're in debt to the federal government for our unemployment insurance, that where is this fee coming from? Where is this tax coming from? Why am I paying more per employee? To cover these expenses? And this is why. It's because of mismanagement, I think, on our unemployment insurance fund, and it's because the state refuses to make it a priority for paying it back as well. So.
Yeah, and I think you're right on that point. And a lot of states had that unemployment debt during the pandemic because unemployment spiked quite high around the country. Yeah. The difference between California and most of the rest of the country, though, is that other states, with the exception of two, paid off all of their unemployment debt to the federal government. So the only two states with debt still outstanding are California and New York. California's debt, last I looked, was now $20 billion owed to the federal government. That's the principal. That's the part that employers have to pay through those higher taxes. And the state has a small in comparison payment on the interest that typically has been done by the general fund. But yeah, as you point out, the governor's proposing to one of those fund shifts I referred to earlier is in that area.
Yeah.
And so the governor's proposal looks like it's taking one of the mandatory debt payments that are required under the Constitution as part of that, actually going back to that rainy day initiative. Part of that is debt reduction too. So the governor looks like he's taken one of those debt reduction payments and using it to pay the interest on the unemployment debt instead. So that,
very interesting.
Yeah. So, but had California, when we had what we thought at the time was a $98 billion surplus, if we'd taken that money and paid off the unemployment debt, then both the employers would not be seeing those tax increases and the state would not have that interest payment. So the state did not make that choice.
Yeah, it's really frustrating. I know the chamber had advocated when we had a surplus for taking a big chunk out of that debt, so employers aren't on the hook for it.
Right.
Today, it's about $63 per employee additionally on top of what you were paying previously. Which adds up to a $1.2 billion annual tax increase on businesses. The thing about that statistic that obviously it's hard on business owners because they're the ones trying to run and actually provide a good or provide a service, but consumers are also going to take a hit on that, right? Because every increase that we place onto employers in some way is going to get passed along to consumers as well. And so, yeah, it's very frustrating.
Yeah, that's correct. And that tax increase is not happening in isolation. There are other, costs that businesses in California face besides that. So, so that nothing happens in a vacuum. That's another cost on top
in addition to
everything else that's gone on.
So what do you think, and we can just hit this briefly, but like, what do you see what's the process over the next few months for the budget? Obviously, legislature is going to start having conversations about this, and then we'll have the May revise in May. But what do you see moving forward?
Yeah, so it's a pretty structured process that does take a while to play out. So we have almost 6 months before the budget has to be enacted, and during that time, both the Senate and the Assembly, the budget committees there are going to hold a number of hearings. Each of those committees has subcommittees which get more into the details of the different issue areas like education or housing or transportation.
Yeah.
And so one thing that your constituents might want to know is that those subcommittees are public. They're open to the public, of course. And so if people want to weigh in on what's going on or offer an opinion or at least kind of watch and kind of see at a more detailed level what's being discussed, those subcommittees are a good way to take a look at that. But a lot of it is going to be preliminary until we get those May revision numbers. Yeah. So the governor's May revision typically comes out May 14th. That tries to take all that tax information from the normal April 15th deadline, use that to come up with the new estimates of what the deficit's going to be. And so I would say a lot of the real quote unquote work happens in that last 6 weeks. Yeah, between May 14th and the end of June. Yeah. Which is because no one in the legislature is going to want to cast a vote to make a big cut or a big budget change before they know exactly how big the problem is. So there's a lot of minutia that never makes the press that gets voted on through the budget process. Some of that will be dealt with before May, but the big decisions won't happen until that home stretch, those last 6 weeks. When life is not fun for people who work on the budget,
especially
or for members
that
serve on the budget committee.
Sure.
Yeah, anyone on the budget committee hates May and June because it's just it's a lot to process in a very short period of time. And like I said, a lot of the real work gets pushed off until that point.
Well, I appreciate that, and to kind of close things out, we usually do like a clip of the week, and so I wanted to play you a little something and get your brief thoughts on it. But one thing that I can report back on that I believe is actually good news is one of the solutions that were proposed by one of my colleagues on solving our budgetary woes in California was the proposal of a new wealth tax that was actually defeated in committee, or at least defeated is a tough word. It was temporarily halted in committee last week in the Revenue and Taxation Committee. It can always come back, but it was pretty clear that most of the members were not on board with it. So I'm going to play you this couple clips back to back here and then get your quick thoughts.
Is there a cap on sort of the amount of taxes that California residents can that they should bear?
That's an interesting question. I mean, academically, I suppose you mean is something like the Laffer curve, right? Is there a point in which you raise less money than the tax rates are so high that you raise less money through having taxes that high? I would say the overwhelming evidence is that no state is anywhere near that point on the Laffer curve. In terms of the tax it would be a 1% to 2% tax on property, so about what everyone else, we're all paying on our houses. So there's room for policy dispute, for sure, but the notion that this would push us over the Laffer curve, I don't think that's seriously.
So we're just scratching the surface.
I mean, this is a substantial tax. It doesn't mean that, and it should be taken seriously, but it doesn't mean that there's some limit out there that we're theoretically approaching.
Proponents of this measure often look to Europe for policy inspiration for wealth tax. However, the evidence gives many reasons for concern. In 1990, 12 countries in Europe had a wealth tax. Today, there are only 3. France's wealth tax contributed to the exodus of an estimated 42,000 millionaires between 2000 and 2012, among other problems leading to its repeal in 2018. These countries all experienced the same challenges. The tax was difficult to administer, it distorted savings and investment decisions, it pushed the rich to take their money out of the taxing countries, and perhaps worse of all, it didn't raise the revenue that it was promised. While I understand the proposal tries to incorporate lessons learned from these countries, the evidence in Europe suggests there will be significant challenges to pursuing this policy at the state rather than the federal level. For all these reasons, I have significant concerns with the policies and its potential impact on our state's competitiveness and future state budgets.
So, on hearing those clips, I think, number one, just curious on your thoughts on, is there a point when Californians are just taxed so much that they will, bow out or it'll become less productive? But also, this idea, and I'm thankful that the wealth tax was halted, and I think the governor even came out and opposed it as well, temporarily. But, to your point about we're so heavily reliant on those top 1% of taxpayers in California, and when you push any of them out, right, or when you encourage them and they have other places to go, as we've seen in Europe, what kind of impact that has on your state revenue, on your state budgets, and obviously, your state as a whole. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's certainly the case that because we are so dependent on a small number of high-income taxpayers, those people tend to be the ones that are best able to make adjustments either in where they're living, moving out of state, or in controlling how where their wealth is housed, or where, how it can be taxed. So there's always a risk of that sort of thing happening. And certainly in recent years, we've seen people moving out. There's some indications that the people moving out more recently tend to be higher income than those who moved out maybe, some years in the past. So,
that's interesting.
So it's certainly it's definitely a risk. There have been some high-profile people moving out of state. But I think to a broader point is that California does not have a revenue problem right now. Even with the deficit, whatever it ends up being, our revenues are still higher than what they were several years ago. The problem is that revenues spiked dramatically in that 2-year window of the pandemic budgets. And so by the governor's Department of Finance summary, revenues went up 55% in a 2-year period from 2019 to from the 2019 fiscal year to 2 years after that. And then the state essentially budgeted as if a lot of that was going to be ongoing revenue, and that was simply not the case.
Yeah. And
what we had was a short-term spike based on federal stimulus, based on capital gains, sorts of factors. And the state didn't budget that way. The state acted like, no, the good times are here to stay. Well, the good times were not here to stay. But even so, our revenues per capita are still really high by historical standards. So the state does not have a revenue problem. The state has a problem in spending beyond its already significant revenues.
Absolutely.
So that's, I think, so yes, there are risk factors to people moving out, certainly. And if that happens to a greater extent, California's budget is going to be in even worse shape. But even without considering that, do we have a revenue problem? Not really.
Yeah.
We've had a drawback from a spike in revenue.
Sure.
That is not. But we're still growing. If you look back 5 years, we're still growing compared to that level. So.
Well, and the growth in the budget that we were discussing kind of indicates this, right?
Right.
California absolutely doesn't have a revenue problem. It has a spending problem, and we need to live within our means. So. I think that is a great place to wrap it up. It's a great way to end a podcast on the California state budget. If you want to share ideas for future shows, you can email me at pointoforderpod@gmail.com. You can watch and subscribe on YouTube at Point of Order Pod. You can follow the pod on social media at Point of Order Pod, and you can follow me at Joshua_Hoover on Twitter or X or whatever people are calling it these days. Kirk, thanks so much for joining me. I really appreciate all your insights.
Absolutely. Thank you.
All right.